So Pope Leo the 14th sat down with Crux magazine and released his first major press interview. Wow. He talks about issues on LGBTQ matters, the Latin Mass, the liturgy, synodality, women's ordination, among other topics. We're going to review it today. I'm not saying this exaggerating. I'm not saying this as kind of a clickbaity thing. This might be the most historic interview I've seen so far. Some are going to see this as a good thing. Others are going to see this as one of the worst things. Either way, I think this one's going to go down in history. We're going to review that coming up next on the Michael Lofton Show. Guys, a lot is going on with this interview. A lot. We could be here dissecting this and breaking it down and connecting the dots and showing implications for this for hours and hours and hours and hours. And obviously, we're not going to have time to do that today. So I'm just going to try to give you an overview, a lay of the land. What I'm going to do is play a 5-minute clip of the interview, specifically the part where he's talking about the LGBTQ stuff. And then we're going to read through the entire portion of this interview because there were evidently multiple interviews that were released. And we're going to look through the entire transcript for this portion. And that will include, again, the LGBTQ stuff, synodality, women's ordination, Latin Mass and liturgy issues, all of that. We're going to take a look at it. I'm going to break it all down, but just giving you my overall thoughts. And I'm probably going to have to come back and do follow-up shows on each one of these topics, talking about them in much, much more detail. So you're going to need to go ahead, hit that subscribe button and hit the bell for notification because there's a lot going on here and it's going to take more than one stream to unpack. Okay, let me go ahead and play this clip for you. Let's just watch this together to kind of prime the pump and get the conversation going. Again, some people are going to love this. Others are going to be absolutely mortified. Let's take a look. Please let me know if there's any difficulties, by the way, in hearing the audio.
Beyond the very strong ideological views that can be present on that issue, how is that something you plan to address?
Well, I don't have a plan at the moment. I was asked about that already a couple of times during these first couple of months about the LGBT issue. What are you going to say? And I recall something that a cardinal from the eastern part of the world said to me something before I was Pope about the Western world is fixated, obsessed with sexuality, so that a person's identity for some people is all about sexual identity, and for many people in other parts of the world, that's not a primary issue in terms of how we should deal with one another. So that's, I confess that's on the back of my mind, because as was seen at the Synod, any issue dealing with the LGBTQ kinds of questions, that also is highly polarizing within the church. And for now, because of what I've already tried to demonstrate and live out in terms of my understanding of being Pope at this time in history, I'm trying not to continue to polarize, promote polarization in the church. And I'm trying to say, which is what Francis said very clearly when he would say, todos. Everyone's invited in. But I don't invite a person in because they are or are not of any specific identity. I invite a person in because he's a son or daughter of God. And say, you're all welcome. And let's get to know one another and respect one another. And at some point, when specific questions will come up, I mean, obviously at some point, people want church doctrine to change, want attitudes to change. I think we have to change attitudes before we ever change doctrine. I find it highly unlikely, in certainly in the immediate future, that the church doctrine, in terms of what the church teaches about sexuality, what the church teaches about marriage. I've already spoken about marriage. As did Pope Francis.
Let me play that part again. Obviously, I'm going to offer some commentary on this, but I think you need to hear that again.
Everyone's invited in, but I don't invite a person in because they are or are not of any specific identity. I invite a person in because he's a son or daughter of God, and we say, you're all welcome, and let's get to know one another and respect one another. And at some point, when specific questions will come up, I mean, obviously at some point, people want church doctrine to change, want attitudes to change. I think we have to change attitudes before we ever change doctrine. I find it highly unlikely in certainly in the immediate future that the church doctrine in terms of what the church teaches about sexuality, what the church teaches about marriage. I've already spoken about marriage. As did Pope Francis when he spoke about a family being a man and a woman in solemn commitment.
Some are saying the audio is difficult. Okay, let's table the audio for now. I'll come back to it. I'll play it later. Let's go ahead and just read the transcript first. And let me just show you what's going on. Let me go to that part first, and then we'll go to the top and read everything else that he says. But let's go straight to the LGBT stuff, because I think that's probably going to be the biggest bombshell here. Okay. Just a quick follow-up on the LGBTQ point. It could be a very ideological issue. However, beyond any ideological views, I think people felt this was just spoken about in a different way with a different tone under Francis. What will your approach be? Well, I don't have a plan at the moment, he says. That alone is a headline right there. I don't have a plan at the moment. Okay. I was asked about that already a couple times during these first couple months about the LGBT issue. I recall something that a cardinal from the eastern part of the world said to me before I was pope about the Western world is fixated, obsessed with sexuality. A person's identity for some people is all about sexual identity, and for many people in other parts of the world, that's not a primary issue in terms of how we should deal with one another. I confess that's on the back of my mind, because as we've seen at the Synod, any issue dealing with LGBTQ questions is highly polarizing within the church. For now, because of what I've already tried to demonstrate and live out in terms of my understanding of being pope at this time in history, I'm trying not to continue to polarize or promote polarization in the church. What I'm trying to say is that Francis said very clearly what he would say, todos, 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 all. Everyone's invited in, but I don't invite a person in because they are or are not of any specific identity. I invite a person in because they are a son or daughter of God. You're all welcome. Let's get to know one another and respect one another. At some point when specific questions will come up, here's the part. People want the church doctrine to change. What doctrine is he talking about? Homosexuality, right? Homosexual acts. People want the church doctrine to change. They want attitudes to change. I think we have to change attitudes before we even think about changing what the church says about any question. Full stop. So he's saying people are wanting the teaching to change, but they also want attitudes to change. We got to change attitudes before we can consider changing the teaching of the church on homosexuality. What does that mean? That means that he believes the teaching could change. Which, y'all, I did a video a few weeks ago showing y'all an interview from him when he was a cardinal just a couple years ago. And he spoke about how the church teaching hasn't yet changed and people aren't yet calling for the change. And I thought, that's so weird. Maybe I'm just reading too much into it when he says yet there. I think this answers our question on whether or not I was reading too much into it at the time. Because after we saw the LGBT rainbow that he allowed to be brought into and processed officially into St. Peter's Basilica, I started to question, does he believe that the church teaching can change? And I thought more about that old interview as a cardinal, and I think I have my answer now. People want the church doctrine to change. They want attitudes to change. I think we have to change attitudes before we can even think about changing what the church says, in this case, teaches, about any given question. I find it highly unlikely, certainly in the near future, that the church's doctrine in terms of what the church teaches about sexuality, what the church teaches about marriage, will change. So, in other words, what he is saying is that right now he doesn't believe the church teaching will change because he thinks the attitudes aren't there yet and society's not ready for it. But he's explicitly saying that the church's teaching on sexuality, and in this case, homosexuality, can change, and maybe in the distant future will change, just not right now in the immediate foreseeable future. And not because it can't change, not because it's infallible, not because it's irreformable, but because attitudes need to change first, and society needs to be ready for that. We'll read it one more time. People want the church doctrine to change, want attitudes to change. I think we have to change attitudes before we can even think about changing what the church says about any given question. I find it highly unlikely, certainly in the near future, that the church's doctrine in terms of what the church teaches about sexuality, what the church teaches about marriage, will change. I know that's not the thing that a lot of people wanted to hear, but I think it's as plain as day, right? And there's some people who are going to say, no, I don't think he meant that by it. And there it is. There it is. It doesn't stop there, though. There's more. I've already spoken about marriage, as did Pope Francis when he was Pope, about a family being a man and a woman in solemn commitment, blessed in the sacrament of marriage, or blessed in the sacrament of marriage. But even to say that, I understand some people will take that badly. In Northern Europe, they are already publishing rituals of blessing. People who love one another is the way they express it, which goes specifically against the document that Pope Francis approved, Fiducia Supplicans, which basically says, of course, we can bless all people, but it doesn't look for a way of ritualizing some kind of blessing, because that's not what the church teaches. That doesn't mean those people are bad people. But I think it's very important, again, to understand how to accept others who are different than we are, how to accept people who make choices in their life and respect them. So here he's talking about people who are in same-sex unions. He's talking about how it doesn't mean they're bad people. It's important to understand, however, how to accept others that are different than we are, how to accept people who make different choices in their life, and for us to respect those people with those decisions. I do understand that this is a very hot button topic, and that some people will make demands to say we want the recognition of gay marriage, for example, or we want recognition of people who are trans. To say this officially recognized and approved by the church. The individuals will be accepted and received. Any priest who has ever heard confessions will have heard confessions from all kinds of people with all kinds of issues, all kinds of states of life and choices that are made. I think that the church's teaching will continue as it is. And that's what I have to say about that for now. I think it's very important. So here he's talking about the church's teaching on marriage, which is distinct from the church's teaching on the question of homosexual acts. Those are two different things, right? But he's saying that he thinks that the teaching will continue as it is. But that's not the shutting of the door on the matter that we would, I think a lot of us would like to see, which is not that the teaching will continue as is, but that it can't change, right? Because simply saying that the teaching will continue as it is doesn't really mean a whole lot if one is still open to the view that it could change. And after what he's saying here about homosexual acts and indicating that it could change, one now wonders, does he think potentially the church's teaching on homosexual marriage could change? We need a lot more clarity here, and this is probably not the response that people were looking for in shutting the door on these conversations and coming out and saying, I'm going to give something ex cathedra defining that all homosexual acts are always intrinsically disordered, and I'm going to shut the door on this conversation that it could ever change in the distant future or at any point. And I'm going to shut the door on the question of homosexual unions in all cases, at all times, in every kind of way. And I'm not going to allow any cracks here in the dam. And I'm going to define it ex cathedra so that we never have to have this conversation ever again. It's far from that. It's almost the opposite of it. So again, it's going to be a response that a lot of people were not hoping for. Whereas I think some others are very happy with this. Like Father James Martin is incredibly happy about this. We'll take a look at his take here in a moment. There's some people who are going to love this. Others are going to be very, very concerned about this. Okay, so he says, families need to be supported what they call the traditional family. The family is father and mother and children. I think that the role of the family in society, which has at times suffered in recent decades, once again has to be recognized, strengthened. I just wonder out loud if the question about polarization and how people treat one another doesn't also come from situations where people did not grow up in the context of a family, where we learn. That's the first place you learn how to love one another, how to live with one another, how to tolerate one another, how to form the bonds of communion. That's the family. If we take away that basic building block, it becomes very difficult to learn that in other ways. I think there are some very key elements that need to be looked at. I believe I'm who I am because I had a wonderful relationship with my father and mother. They had a very happy married life for over 40 years. Even today, people comment on this. Even with my brothers, we're still very close, even though one is far on one end politically. We're in different places. I think one of his brothers is like really conservative and traditional, and that brother has said that Leo's kind of more liberal. In my experience, that has been an extremely important factor of who I am and how I've been able to be who I am. There's another quick follow-up on the Synod. In addition to the study groups that have already been established, you created 2 new ones, one for the liturgy, one for Episcopal conferences and ecclesial assemblies. Why? What do you think needs to be studied about these topics? He says, these actually were approved by Francis already, right at the end of his pontificate. They both have grown out of some of the other issues that were studied at the Synod. The Episcopal conferences, which actually began, again, some of them in Latin America first, before the time of the council, but then were much more developed at the time of the council in terms of the role of the Bishops' Conference and how they can help the church in any different country or region. I think that generally speaking, there has been a great appreciation for the role of bishops' conferences. Today, you won't have the situation where a bishop on this side of the river is preaching A and the bishop on that side of the river is doing something totally different. We come together and we look at the questions together to make common policies or take common approaches given the area, the culture, the language the people are working with. So on a pastoral level, there's already been great value there. The question is raised going back quite a few years about how much actual authority can be given to a bishop's conference. There's been a lot of theological debate on this since Vatican II because the successor of the apostles is the individual bishop, not the bishop's conference. The tension that can come up between whether a bishop's conference can make a decision and if the individual bishops have to follow it. That's gone back and forth in different places in different ways through the years. There was a desire expressed at the Synod to take a closer look at that and to see if the bishop conferences couldn't have a greater role in trying to have the bishops come together and make decisions which are helpful for the life of the church in their given region or country. The role of the nuncios, that's also been studied now in a separate group. It makes much more sense for a regional church to study, reflect, and choose policies or approaches that will be most helpful for the church in that area rather than every individual bishop on its own. So it's a way of supporting bishops in that ministry. There are some of the things that we looked at there. There was concern raised about an expression in one of the documents about the role of bishops and bishop conferences. It asked the question, should the Episcopal conferences have a certain doctrinal authority? And that got translated in different ways during the Synod, but even in the original document, it's not translated the same way from the language to language. I pointed that out. Some of the English-speaking bishops became very upset, actually, thinking that the bishops in Northern Europe could make a decision changing the doctrine of the church on divorce and remarriage or homosexual relationships or on polygamy. That's another issue which the African bishops have brought forward, going back to the issues that are not easily reconcilable within the formal doctrine of the church. So because of translation differences, that became a question of discussion of the Synod. But the issue remains as Episcopal conferences have developed what kind of role they can play. Now, regarding the study group on liturgy, what is being studied? How much of the reason for establishing this was related to divisions surrounding the traditional Latin Mass? for example, or issues as the new Amazonian rite. Okay, so a lot of people are looking for him. Where does he kind of land on the question of Latin Mass? All right, this is going to give some insights. Some are going to be happy with it. Others are going to be very, very disappointed. Okay, my understanding of what the group came out of is primarily from issues that have to do with the enculturation of the liturgy. How to continue the process of making the liturgy more meaningful within a different culture, within a specific culture, in a specific place at any given time. I think that was the primary issue. There's another issue, which is also another hot button issue, which I've already received a number of requests and letters about. The question about people always say the Latin Mass. Well, you can say Mass in Latin right now. If it's the Vatican II rite, there's no problem. Obviously, between the Tridentine Mass and the Vatican II Mass, the Mass of Paul VI, I'm not sure where that's going to go. It's obviously very complicated, he says. And I've already seen some people say they feel that it's not complicated. It's an open and shut case, so some people are not happy with that response. I do know that part of the issue, that issue unfortunately has been, again, part of a process of polarization. People have used the liturgy as an excuse for advancing other topics. It's become a political tool, and that's very unfortunate. I think sometimes the, say, abuse of the liturgy from what we call Vatican II Mass was not helpful for people who were looking for a deeper experience of prayer, of contact with the mystery of faith that they seemed to find in the celebration of the Tridentine Mass. Again, we've become polarized, so that instead of being able to say, well, if we celebrate Vatican II liturgy in a proper way, do you really find that much difference between this experience and that experience? Some are going to say no, others are going to say, yeah, oh, absolutely. They're going to say Vatican II liturgy, even properly celebrated, is still an offense to God. Y'all know who I'm talking about here. Others are going to say, well, no, if it's properly celebrated, it's fine. It's not an offense to God, but it might be still in some sense lesser than the Tridentine Mass. And others are going to say, oh, I feel it's way better if it's celebrated properly, way better than the Latin Mass. So there's definitely a lot of differences here. I have not had the chance to really sit down with a group of people who are advocating for the Tridentine rite, he says. There's an opportunity coming up soon, and I'm sure there will be occasions for that. But that is an issue that I think also maybe with synodality, we have to sit down and talk about it. So he's suggesting perhaps the role of synodality should factor into the question of the Latin Mass. But that is an issue that I think also maybe with synodality, we have to sit down and talk about. It's become that kind of issue that's so polarized that people aren't willing to listen to one another oftentimes. I've heard bishops talk to me. They've talked to me about that, where they say we invited them to this and that. They just won't even hear it. They don't even want to talk about it. That's a problem in itself. It means we're into ideology now. We're no longer into the experience of church communion. That's one of the issues on the agenda. Okay, so there's the LGBT stuff. There's the Latin Mass stuff. Let's maybe go back to the top and kind of look at where he talks a little bit more about synodality. In a synodal way, for most people, certainly the understanding that the role of women in the church has to continue to develop. I think in that sense, there was a positive response. I hope to continue in the footsteps of Francis, including in appointing women to some leadership roles at different levels in the church's life, recognizing the gifts that women have that can contribute to the life of the church in many ways. The topic becomes a hot button issue when the specific question is asked about ordination. What the Synod had spoken about specifically was the ordination perhaps of women deacons, which has been a question that's been studied for many years now. There's been different commissions appointed by different popes to say, what can we do about this? I think that will continue to be an issue. I, at the moment, don't have an intention of changing the teaching of the church on the topic. I think there are some previous questions that have to be asked. Now, that's a curious way of putting it. He didn't say discipline, because there have been historically, women deaconesses in the Latin Rite, and there are right now in Eastern Orthodoxy. There are some in Oriental Orthodoxy. He didn't speak about the question of discipline. He spoke about teaching, doctrine. And there is a debate on the two. right? You know, historically, women deaconesses, was that some kind of sacramental ordination, or was that a non-sacramental ordination? And that is kind of a doctrinal question, not merely disciplinary. And now he's putting it in terms not just of discipline, but in terms of doctrine. I, at the moment, don't have an intention of changing the teaching of the church on the topic, but that indicates that he does believe it could potentially change at some point. That's going to be a message that some people are going to love, and for others, that's going to be incredibly disappointing. Because for people, a lot of people, they're going to say, to speak of the doctrine in terms of changing, even if he's not suggesting changing it now, maybe he will later on in his pontificate, but right now he's not suggesting changing it, but he is indicating that it could change. Some people are going to feel like, no, wait, this is dogmatic that women cannot be ordained to any of the orders of ordination. Not just the episcopate, not just the priesthood, but also the diaconate. And women deaconesses, they'll argue, were merely a non-sacramental ordination, and that sacramental ordination is not possible for deaconesses. And they'll argue, if you do believe it's possible, then there's nothing to stop you then from the next level, which is the priesthood, and then the next level, which is the episcopate, and then Catholicism becomes Anglicanism. So he didn't restrict himself to discussions about non-sacramental disciplinary women's ordination issues for the diaconate. He's talking full-blown about teachings, which would mean sacramental ordination to the diaconate for women. And to say that the teaching could change, that's probably going to be very scandalous to a lot of people. They might not be aware that the church has this concept of some teachings that are irreformable and others that are reformable in nature. But he's putting this in the category of reformable doctrine. I think that's going to raise a lot of eyebrows. He continues, just one small example earlier this year when there was the Jubilee for permanent deacons, so obviously all men, but their wives were present. I had the catechesis one day with a fairly large group of English-speaking permanent deacons. The English language is one of the groups where they are better represented because there are more parts of the world that never really promoted to the permanent diaconate. And that itself becomes a question. Why would we talk about ordaining women to the diaconate if the diaconate itself is not yet properly understood and properly developed and promoted within the church? For him, the reason why he's not going to change the doctrine yet is not because he believes it can't change. No, he believes it can change. The reason why right now he doesn't have any intentions of changing it is not because of some immutable, irreformable, infallible teaching, but because, well, we haven't understood the male diaconate yet sufficiently when it comes to the permanent diaconate. So we need to get that down better before we could talk about women being part of it. Again, that's going to be thrilling to some people. They're going to love this. Others are going to be horrified by that, right? And what are the reasons for that? So while I think there was a significant inspiration at the time of the council when the permanent diaconate was in effect reinstated, it has not become in many parts of the world what I think some people thought it would be early on. So I think there are some questions that have to be asked around the issue. I also wonder, in terms of a comment I made about one of the press conferences I participated in the Synod, in terms of what has oftentimes been identified as clericalism in the present structures of the church, would we simply be wanting to invite women to become clericalized? And what has that really solved? Perhaps there's a lot of things that have to be looked at and developed at this time before we can ever really come around to asking the other questions. That's where I see things right now. I'm certainly willing to continue to listen to people. In other words, his position may change on this. There are these study groups, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which has responsibility for some of those questions. They continue to examine the theological background, history, and some of those questions, and we'll walk with that and see what comes. And then follows the part about the LGBTQ stuff. And in each one of these cases, I'm seeing him being very adamant. Like, a lot of people are polarized, and I don't want to be polarized. I don't want to be polarizing. But in each one of these cases, his comments are very polarizing, even if that's not his intention. He clearly doesn't want to be polarizing. He already feels that the church is polarized and divisive enough divided enough on these things, and he wants to heal that. But I can tell you right now, looking through his responses, this is going to be a very polarizing interview. Some people are going to love it. Some people are going to hate it. I don't know if there's going to be a lot of people indifferent about it. So that is what's going on here. I want to take a look at what Father James Martin has to say about this when it comes to that section on the LGBTQ stuff. So he's very well known for pushing this stuff in the church. He was the one kind of behind this pilgrimage, LGBTQ pilgrimage in Rome, where Pope Leo allowed them to process officially a rainbow cross and rainbow flags and transgender flags into St. Peter's Basilica. In fact, I want to show you something. I'm pulling it up right now. Hold on. He was also the one, Pope Leo was the one who personally sent this bishop, Bishop Savino, to celebrate a mass with LGBTQ Catholics, this particular group who went into St. Peter's Basilica with all that. Outreach, an LGBTQ Catholic ministry that's highly controversial for attempting to change the church's teaching on homosexuality, is pointing out that the bishop is saying, Pope Leo urged me to celebrate Mass with LGBTQ Catholics. Okay, so on the heels of all that, Father James Martin has been very happy with Pope Leo and how that all went down. And Father James Martin offers his thoughts about today's interview. Let's see what he has to say. Dear friends, here is Pope Leo XIV's thoughtful answer to a question on LGBTQ people. After that are my reflections on Pope Leo's comments, which were very much in line with our conversation a few weeks ago in the Apostolic Palace. So some people thought that maybe when Father James Martin met with Pope Leo and he came out loving Pope Leo, saying this is amazing, some people thought, oh no, he's lying. He's just up to a publicity stunt. Well, I think we know now the nature of that interview and how it went down independently of what Martin said about it, right? Okay. He says, in short, it's a continuation of the approach of Pope Francis, focusing on the pastoral rather than, at least in the near future, the doctrinal. I think it's a step beyond Pope Francis, in fairness to Pope Francis. Pope Francis did limit himself to the pastoral and not doctrinal. Pope Leo is taking the conversation a step further into reforming the doctrine at some point in the future, either him or one of his successors, but acknowledging that the church could change its teaching on sexuality in the context of homosexuality. That's going a step beyond Pope Francis. Pope Francis said homosexuality is a sin, and he never said that the teaching itself could change. What we're seeing from Pope Leo is that the teaching could change. I don't see any other way to read it. You know, I'm giving the judgment of charity, trying to read it in the best possible way, and I don't see any other way to read them. And if that's a misreading of them, I think he needs to be more clear. But ironically, I think he was very clear, and I think maybe some people aren't ready to hear where he lands on this, but I think he is very clear. Okay, but you know, he then quotes the interview, Father James Martin, and then here's Father James Martin's reflections. My reflections, he says. Pope Leo's response to this question is very much along the lines of Pope Francis's response, which I find very helpful. The Holy Father is for a church that welcomes todos, 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 but is also saying that it's highly unlikely that church teaching on sexuality will change in the near future. So he's picking up on these qualifications, and he's stressing, Father James Martin is stressing the fact that, in other words, the teaching could change according to Pope Leo. And of course, Pope Leo is correct that LGBTQ people are still highly polarizing issue in the Catholic Church. The Synod showed us that. But two things stand out for me in his remarks. First, the Holy Father's desire for people to get to know one another and respect one another, which when it comes to LGBT people is still a challenge in many parts of the church. Also an appeal to a change in attitude as a precursor to any other change, like a doctrinal change. Second is his use of the term LGBT and LGBTQ, which itself is a step forward. At the Synod, there are many who objected even to the term. So my sense, and this was my sense from meeting with him a few weeks ago, is that Pope Leo's approach to LGBTQ Catholics is a continuation of Pope Francis's approach, which is all to the good. So he is incredibly happy with this. He's very satisfied. He has no criticisms, no problems. And he also links to the video. Yeah, well, so and it's not just like a transcript issue, right? Because we did watch the video where he says this clearly in video. We watched it in 4K. So it's not one of those cases where maybe the interviewer, tampered with the transcript or something. People want the church doctrine to change, want attitudes to change. I think we have to change attitudes before we even think about changing what the church says about any given topic. I find it highly unlikely, certainly in the near future, that the church's doctrine in terms of what the church teaches about sexuality, what the church teaches about marriage, will change. I've told y'all that I've kind of done a number of videos explaining to y'all, here's how, if the liberals attempt to change church doctrine on this question of homosexuality, here's how they'll attempt to do it. I've pointed out to you, there are no instances of the magisterium solemnly defining that all homosexual acts are intrinsically evil. And your Father James Martins of the world know that, right? They know that. There are authoritative teachings that homosexual acts are sinful, but there are no definitive teachings that it's intrinsically evil in all particular cases. That door has not been closed. And I did a show recently telling y'all, Pope Leo needs to come out and close the door on that and deliver ex cathedra, an infallible, solemn papal definition, infallibly saying that homosexual acts are always intrinsically evil. Not only is he not going to do that, he's now coming out in this interview saying technically the doctrine could change. A lot of people are going to say, but I thought the teachings of the church on homosexuality are irreformable in nature, infallible in nature. So they couldn't change. I've been starting to ask the question, does Pope Leo believe that? Because I've been seeing things indicating to me that he doesn't believe that. I think this interview answers that question, whether or not he believes this is an infallible teaching or not, whether this is irreformable or not. I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt, interpret this in the best possible way, steel man what he's saying, and I don't see any way to read this as any other way that means Pope Leo thinks the church's teaching on homosexuality in some cases could change. He might have the view that a lot of liberals have, which is that in some cases homosexuality is wrong and in other cases it's not, and they'll try to qualify it. In this particular circumstance, it's not intrinsically disorder. Maybe in this case it's wrong. Maybe in this case it's evil, but not in this particular case. And they try to use that distinction as well as the distinctions between what is ideal, the sacrament of marriage between a man and woman, that's the ideal, but these other kinds of unions, they might not be ideal, but they're not necessarily intrinsically evil. They'll try to make that distinction and smuggle through their agenda that way. Others will try to smuggle through their agenda by saying, see, the church has never infallibly taught this is evil in all cases, and therefore we can smuggle through the back door, through that little crack, that there could be some cases where homosexuality in some cases is not sinful. And whether he intended it or not, I think that Pope Leo just handed on a silver platter to Father James Martin and the crowd that wants the church's teaching to change. I think he handed to them on a silver platter what they've been wanting, and that is for a pope to theoretically acknowledge it could change. To my knowledge, no pope prior to Pope Leo has ever even conceived that this could even theoretically change. I think he's the first to open the door on that. And I've been asking y'all in conversations recently, is there an incremental and slow attempt to open the door to the conversation, then suggest it, and then later on come back and actually put the magisterium behind an attempt to change it? Is that what we're witnessing, or is this a big misunderstanding? Is there something that we're missing from him? Was he maybe unclear? You know, Pope Leo doesn't strike me as having the same difficulties that Pope Francis had in being unclear and speaking off the cuff kind of thing. He doesn't strike me as a guy who struggles with that as much as Pope Francis did. He strikes me as somebody who's more careful in his words. And this isn't the first time he's kind of said something along these lines, but it is the first time he said it explicitly. I don't get the impression he's unclear, not careful enough. I think that might be the difficulty. He is very sufficiently clear on this. And again, I think some people are going to experience a lot of cognitive dissonance, and they're going to be like, oh, there's no way. That's not what he said. And I understand why some people would experience that kind of cognitive dissonance and have that kind of reaction. Look, I understand. I totally get it. But, you know, I think he is sufficiently clear on where he stands on this. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that he is ever going to move forward on what he believes here, right? It could be, but that he thinks the church teaching could change, but he'll never move on that. But the problem there is the number one suggests that it could. That's already a problem. But number two, it enables future popes to come along and push the envelope even more. And it certainly doesn't prevent that situation from ever happening. You need a person, especially if they're the Pope, to believe it can't change, so that they come out and say, I'm going to make sure and prevent this from ever being a topic of consideration moving forward. I'm not going to enable people who believe this. I'm not going to put them in places of authority. I'm not going to make them cardinals and they could potentially become a pope. And I'm not going to leave the door open to this discussion. I'm just going to go ahead and put this thing to bed and declare ex cathedra that this is always immoral and that's infallible in nature. He could easily do it. It would take 5 minutes for him to do that. I could do that as just a regular me, Michael Lawley, as just a regular guy. I could come out with something and write the document ex cathedra within 5 minutes. If I could do that, I know Leo could do it. I know his advisors can do it. I know the dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith can prepare it. If he doesn't come out and do that, I've been asking y'all, if he doesn't come out and do that, you have to ask why. I think we have the answer as to why now. Because he doesn't believe that that is something that either is infallibly established or should be infallibly established. I think we got the answer. At the very least, what it does is it confuses a lot of people who thought that this issue was already settled in Catholicism. And it also weakens the side that wants to shut the door on that. And it strengthens and emboldens the other side, like your Father James Martin's, who want to push for a case that homosexuality is not always sinful and is not intrinsically disordered. And again, you're saying, you know, Father James Martin, who kind of represents that side that wants to see the doctrinal change, they're very happy with this because this is giving them on a silver platter what they've been pushing for years. It's not all that they want. It's not all they've been pushing for, but it's a huge boost. And in a way that I don't think Pope Francis did or any pope prior to him ever did. I'm not aware of any pope going this far in expressing publicly their thoughts on the church's position on homosexuality being reformable in nature. There are some popes who may have been homosexual and in some cases may have acted on that in their pontificate, but those people never came out and publicly said, I think the church's teaching on this could change, right? This is an interview of, I think, a different nature than anything we've seen before. So again, I think this is going to be a very polarizing interview, which ironically is the case because he clearly doesn't want to be polarizing. And he says that. He's very clear. I don't want. He says the church is already polarized. Don't want that. But I think his statements on the Latin Mass, on the LGBT stuff, on women's ordination, even on synodality, every single one of those topics is going to be polarizing because of what he said in each one of these cases. And as I told you at the beginning of the show, look, there's a lot more dots to connect. There's a lot more I could say about each and every one of these. There's a lot more implications to these things. I can't cover everything in one video. And I also can't respond to everyone's objection. Well, Michael, I think you misread them here. Here's why I don't think I misread them. I can't respond to everything in one video, but I do intend to have some more follow-up videos, maybe engaging some of that, and maybe also engaging some of the challenges that you'll have. If you think, hey, I'm misreading something, fair enough. Hey, feel free to disagree with me, right? If you think I've misread him, I certainly am not trying to. Trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, steel man him, read him carefully and in context and consider everything. And if I'm missing something, hey, let me know in the comment section, give me that feedback. And, it wouldn't be the first time I've been wrong, and be more than happy to correct myself. Wouldn't be the first time I've done that on this channel, right? But I think I have a pretty good read on him here. And, I want to not only consider what y'all have to say, but I do want to explore what some implications for this interview are moving forward. And show y'all maybe some of the concerns that people are going to have from this, right? So like I said, this isn't the final word on the matter. I'm going to have more videos. Please hit that like button and hit the subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications so you know when I have more follow-ups to this. But go ahead and put those comments there in the comment section. I want to hear from you. Do you agree or disagree with Pope Leo? Do you think that here's what he meant, and let's have that conversation. Let's keep it respectful, right? Respectful to Pope Leo and anyone else in the conversation. But let's also be frank and open and honest about what is being discussed here and express what those concerns are. Or if you think this is a great thing, you don't have concerns, why? Tell me why you have that position, and let's have that conversation. Let's talk to you as well. So go ahead and again, put those thoughts there in the comment section. Now I'm going to come back with some more follow-up material in the days to come. Okay, everybody, again, hit that subscribe button and also consider supporting me at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. I do want to point y'all to my courses on the magisterium that will help give you some ideas on how the magisterium works, help familiarize yourself with how this works. And let me share my screen. It's rtcourses.com. And right now I have the entire magisterial studies program, all 3 courses that I teach at a Catholic university on the magisterium, available at a bundled price, $300 off. So $599 instead of $999. So go and check that out. And once you get that, it will also give you some discounts on other courses that I have here as well. And I think you'll really enjoy those. And more courses to come, so y'all stay tuned. Okay, looking forward to reading y'all's thoughts there in the comment section. God bless.